Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Angel Resendiz. Also known as the Railroad Killer, Angel is said to have committed somewhere around 23 horrific crimes during his spree in both the United States and Mexico in the 1990s. He went on to become known as the Railroad Killer because of the fact that most of his crimes were committed near railroads, where he had just jumped off of trains he was using to travel around the country. Most of his crimes took place in the homes of those he harmed, and usually after the crimes he'd linger around to eat their food and sometimes steal their sentimental items. Sometimes he'd even take jewelry to re-gift to his mother and sister. In June of 1999, he was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and when his sister saw him there, she was worried he would continue harming people, so she thankfully contacted the authorities. After this, they were able to convince him to surrender and he was sent to trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death by the jury, and although there were multiple appeal attempts, his death warrant was signed, and on June 27, 2006, he received his sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who used Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in this case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At the same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully this case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Chase. This evil person is said to have taken the lives of 6 people within the span of a month between 1977 and 1978. That's a lot of people in a very short amount of time, which is absolutely terrifying. Before his crimes, Richard's life was already full of terrible stories and horrific acts that had him spending time in mental institutions before his crime spree. While at these facilities, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but after going through treatment and beginning medication, he was deemed to no longer be a threat to society and was released into his mother's care. Here's where things take a turn for the worse, however. Instead of helping take care of Richard, his mother instead weaned him off of his medication and got him all set up with his own apartment. Nice. Really helpful and cool of her. Initially, when he moved into the apartment, he had roommates, but eventually they all moved out and he was alone, which is when things really got wild. He began killing various animals, which he would then eat raw, sometimes mixing the organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and then drinking it. It's horrible. After this, he would unfortunately go on his killing spree, which had horrific details and would only end when he was startled by a visitor at the home of where his final crime took place. He fled the scene, but he was later caught and stood trial. Although there were many attempts to have him be spared of the death sentence, in the end this didn't work. In December of 1980, Richard was found passed away in his jail cell after taking too many of his prescribed medication. In our number 7 spot today, we have Rodney Alcala. Rodney is a horrible monster who was convicted and sentenced to death for 5 killings that he committed in California from 1977 to 1979. He also received an additional 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 other killings in New York in 1971 and 1977. Rodney got away with his crimes for a while because he wasn't the top of the list of suspects, because he was said to be the quote charming photographer. Rodney is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the show, which, with what we now know about him, is absolutely horrifying. What's crazy is that he actually won the show he was on, but the episode's bachelorette refused to go on a date with him because she found him creepy. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. It isn't exactly known just how many victims Rodney had. It is potentially thought that it could be much higher than the number he was convicted for. In July of last year, Rodney passed away in prison at the age of 77. In our number 6 spot today, we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40, he just couldn't remember the names of all of them. but of course, he could remember the details of all of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only one count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted for 25 minutes straight, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable. In our number 5 spot today, we have John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. This pair is referred to as the DC Snipers, and they were responsible for a series of coordinated attacks during a 3-week period in October of 2002. The pair took the lives of 10 people and critically injured 3 others during this spree, although their crimes spanned even before this and involved even more people. Their crimes were random and terrifying. People would just be going about their everyday tasks when this horrific pair would strike. Through a series of quote-unquote mistakes the pair made, they were able to be caught by authorities and arrested. In September of 2003, John Allen was sentenced to death, and this sentence was carried out in November of 2009. John Lee, on the other hand, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, but very recently it was determined that his sentence needs to be re-looked at because of his young age when the crimes were committed. In our number 4 spot today, we have Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. A 2-for-1 of the most horrific kind, this pair was often referred to as the Toolbox Killers. They received this name because most of what they used to commit their crimes would be items normally stored in a household toolbox. The pair committed 5 of these crimes in Southern California over a 5-month period in 1979. In the end, what led to their capture was when Roy met up with a friend with whom he had previously been incarcerated with. He confessed to the crimes to this person in great detail, and you know what this person did? They consulted their attorney about this horrifying confession, who then advised them to go to the authorities with the information. Thank goodness. Authorities, while they didn't have the evidence necessary to charge the men with the crimes at that time, were able to, through surveillance, find other things to arrest them for, while they searched their homes to find the evidence that they really did need. The pair stood trial, and in the end, Lawrence was sentenced to death, and Roy, who accepted a plea bargain and agreed to testify against Lawrence, received a life sentence. Lawrence died of natural causes while on death row in December of 2019, as did Roy at the California Medical Facility in 2020. FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas described Lawrence as the most disturbing individual for whom he has ever created a criminal profile. In our number 3 spot today, we have Robert Hansen. Robert is often referred to as the Butcher Baker, and his story truly is horrific. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness, where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling the streets at night. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Paulson, who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today, we have William Bonin. This horrible person is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 21 young men in Southern California from May of 1979 to June 1980. It is said that on at least 12 of these occasions he was assisted by one of his 4 known accomplices, and it is even speculated that he might be responsible for 15 more of these crimes that evidence hasn't officially been able to connect him to. He was often referred to as the freeway killer because of the fact that most of the bodies were found along the freeway of Southern California. The police surveilled William until they could catch him in the act, which they did. In the beginning he claimed innocence. I mean, they caught him in the act, it's kind of dumb to claim innocence, but after receiving an impassioned letter from one of the victim's mothers, which asked him to please share the location of her son's body, he confessed his guilt. But he made sure to clarify that it wasn't so the mother could be at peace or so that her pain could be eased. No, of course not. Instead, he said, quote, "I was dying for a hamburger and I knew if I went out with the cops they would get me a hamburger." At his first trial, the prosecutor described him as, quote, "the most arch-evil person who ever existed." William was convicted on 14 of his crimes and was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before his sentence was carried out in 1996. In our number 1 spot today we have Israel Keyes. Israel is quite a prolific serial killer and truly is a terrifying person. While everyone on this list is horrible, Israel is particularly scary because of the fact that he had no MO or type. He just killed at random. In fact, he was so prepared for these random crimes that he left kill kits all over the US so that he would be prepared for whenever whoever he chose crossed his path. It isn't quite clear how many of these crimes he committed, and many missing persons reports that are still open could potentially be linked to him. It is said that Israel had a sort of admiration and obsession with other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy or Robert Hansen, who we already talked about today. He even said, quote, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." So creepy. In March of 2012, Israel was finally apprehended and was to stand trial for his crimes, but unfortunately while waiting for trial, he went on to take his own life. He left behind a note and a drawing of 11 skulls, which led authorities to believe that this may be the number of victims he had. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Quincy Allen. Quincy Allen is a man who went on a crime spree between July and August of 2002 where he took the lives of 4 people. His crime spree was actually inspired while he was in prison serving time for stealing a vehicle. It was here that a fellow inmate decided to start recruiting others and told him that he could get Quincy a job as a mafia hitman. When Quincy was released, he decided to buy a shotgun so he could start practicing. Man, I really wish he showed this kind of dedication to literally anything else. Quincy started off this horrific crime spree on July 7th, 2002 by attacking a 51-year-old homeless man who was sleeping at the time. Luckily, this man was able to survive the attack. His crimes continued until he was arrested on August 14th, 2002. After his arrest and trial, Quincy received a sentence of death and is still on death row awaiting execution. His sentencing did not deter him from the criminal life, however, as in 2009, Quincy, along with another inmate, planned an attack on a correctional officer at the prison they both reside at. Quincy was intended to be executed on January 8th, 2010, but there was a stay of execution that was accepted, and as of July 26th, 2022, literally just over a month ago, Quincy's death sentence was overturned. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer is one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just another level of being messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up though, because it is wild. So you know those like family DNA tests like 23andMe where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these kinds of services helped identify who the real Golden State Killer was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the Golden State Killer DNA profile, which they were able to obtain from the crime scenes, to the website GED Match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as this DNA match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out 2 main suspects. After covertly collecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James D'Angelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served, as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old and will definitely spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 8 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, or the Son of Sam, is an American serial killer who terrorized New York from July of 1976 to July of 1977. He took the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others, all while eluding the biggest manhunt in New York City history. He was one of those arrogant ones who leaves like little notes for the police promising to do it again, but his arrogant self was caught for his crimes and he was arrested on August 10th, 1977 and was indicted for his crimes. He confessed to all of them and claimed that he was just obeying the orders of a demon that had manifested itself in the form of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. He was found mentally competent to stand trial and he pleaded guilty to his crimes, which left him sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which yeah, duh, but he did say that he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as a part of that. These claims were investigated, but no one has ever been able to confirm or deny them. In our number 7 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree unalive and 1 count of conspiracy to commit unalive. He originally received a death sentence, but it ended up being commuted to life in prison. Get this, you guys, though, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits, he was able to have 4 children. 4 children. But thankfully in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he got divorced because his wife had met someone else. I hope so. In our number 6 spot today, we have Scott Erskine. Early in life, Scott began to commit violent crimes against others that I truly cannot even speak about here on YouTube, they're so bad. He spent 4 years in prison for one of these crimes when he was around 17 years old, but when he was paroled after the 4 years, he immediately began committing crimes again. In 1993, Scott invited a woman who was waiting for the bus into his home and ended up holding her hostage for several days. After letting her go, he was quickly arrested and ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison. This is when he had to submit DNA to a database, and in March of 2001, that DNA was matched when the cold cases of the unsolved killings of Jonathan Sellers and Charlie Keever were reopened. In 2004, a jury sentenced him to death, and 6 days later he was transferred to San Quentin. In an interesting turn of events, Scott did die on death row, but it wasn't due to a scheduled execution. Scott died a couple of years ago in July of 2020 after contracting COVID-19. In our number 5 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles' story starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester, and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps, using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today, we have Sean Great. Sean is a serial killer who committed a series of crimes from 2006 until he was apprehended in 2016. Throughout his decade of criminal activity, it is thought that he took the lives of at least 5 people. So basically, his story is a little confusing, but in September of 2016, Sean was arrested and later indicted for 2 killings as well as a kidnapping and harming a woman whose 911 call actually led to his arrest. At the same time, in another county next door, he was also being charged with 2 other deaths as well as another one from all the way back in 2016. This final count from all of those years ago was actually an unsolved Jane Doe case who had been unidentified for 12 years. When Sean confessed to this crime, he wasn't even sure who she was, he just said he believed her name was Dana. On May 7th, 2018, Sean was convicted on 2 of the counts, and on March 1st, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the others, and on September 11th, 2019, he pleaded guilty to the additional count. In the end, he was sentenced to death and has remained on death row since that final plea and sentencing, and he is currently scheduled to be executed in 2025. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on this list because while there are a plethora of terrifying people on this list, nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of them all. The Zodiac killer took the lives of 5 people in the San Francisco Bay Area between 1968 and October of 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples or a lone male cab driver. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. While no one has heard from the Zodiac since 1974, the case remains active in many different counties, and maybe one day we'll finally know who the real Zodiac is. In our number 2 spot today, we have Dale Hausner and Samuel Dietman. Known as the serial shooters, the crimes these guys committed are definitely on the list of fears I have, which I'm pretty sure spawned from a Criminal Minds episode. These 2 were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006. Basically, they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random drive-by shootings. That's the really scary part. The fire thing is also bad, don't get me wrong. There's just something about completely random violence that absolutely terrifies me. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes. In particular, one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, he was found guilty of 80 out of the 87 felony charges that were brought forth, and that was all in one single trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Doodler. While this nickname sounds very sweet, it, like everything else on this list, is very sinister. The nickname that this unidentified killer received is due to his practice of sketching his victims before taking their lives. This unidentified killer committed their crimes in the San Francisco area from January of 1974 to September of 1975, and they specifically targeted gay men. It is believed that 14 deaths can be attributed to this killer, while 3 others were injured in the process. Unfortunately, because of the stigma and sensitivity surrounding gay men at the time, the 3 who survived this monster were very reluctant when speaking with the authorities for fear of being outed as a result of it. This has led to there being very little information for them to work with in terms of identifying the man responsible. For a while, there was a primary suspect, but that person has never been officially charged because sadly, none of the survivors felt comfortable enough to testify in court. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the River City Ripper. One of the most terrifying things that exists are serial killers who are still on the loose, especially when you find out that they've been recently active. This serial killer is wanted in connection to 4 different incidents that occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas, 3 of which were fatal. These horrific crimes took place between August of 2020 and April of 2021, and despite one of the victims thankfully surviving the attack and being able to provide a description of the assailant, there's still very little to go on in terms of being able to identify this horrible human. The FBI was contacted shortly after the survivor was able to give a testimony to authorities, and their behavioral analysis team created a profile of this unidentified killer. These crimes are terrible any way you spin them, but one of the most terrifying parts is that they were all just random acts of violence that occurred completely unprovoked. The case has gained quite a bit of attention, but still, the monster remains at large. In our number 9 spot today, we have Tommy Lynn Sells. Before I get into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up if you're enjoying the video. It really does help us out. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who's responsible for 22 confirmed deaths, but authorities have said that they know that there are more. I actually watched an interview that he did, and one of the aspects that scared me the most while watching him talk about his crimes is how you can tell that he committed these acts because he wanted to, and because he liked it. In the end, Tommy was caught because of someone who survived his attack in the most incredible way. She was able to go on and give such a good description of him that it led to his capture, and she was able to positively identify him. Not only did she save her own life, but who knows how many others. In the end, Tommy and his crimes were deemed so horrific that he received the death sentence. While in jail, he said that there wasn't one day that went by where he didn't think about, quote, the one that got away, which is absolutely chilling. Tommy's life came to an end when he was executed on April 3rd, 2014. In our number 8 spot today, we have Glenn Stewart Godwin. Man, this guy definitely has quite the history. So basically, in 1980, Glenn was working in California and didn't really have too much of a criminal record. For some reason, he and his roommate, however, decided to to make a plan to rob someone that they knew who was once a friend of theirs. Of course, things go awry, and it turns into a botched robbery, and Glenn ends up taking the life of the person they were robbing. Also, this isn't necessarily important to what we're talking about today, but it's so unhinged I just can't leave it out. In an attempt to destroy evidence, Glenn tried to blow up the crime scene. The explosive went off, but obviously they were still able to figure out who committed the crime. Both Glenn and his roommate were both tried and convicted for the crimes in 1983. This, of course, is not where the story ends. In 1987, Glenn tried to escape prison and failed, and this landed him at a higher security prison, Folsom State Prison, which is maximum security. Somehow, once at this new prison, he attempted another escape, and this time was successful. He fled to Mexico, where he tried unsuccessfully to be a part of the illegal drug trade. He was arrested again and sentenced in Mexico, and this is when American authorities began the process of getting him extradited. During this process, Glenn decided that it would be a brilliant idea to take the life of an inmate who was a member of the Mexican drug cartel, which very obviously slowed the process of extradition. This gave him time to plan another escape, which he did in 1991, and since then, he's been on the run. No one knows where he is. How lovely. In our number 7 spot today, we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and very dramatic, but of course, an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was just cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your tight 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they all came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. In prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her partner as well, and the two became besties and even had an affair in jail. But throughout the whole thing, Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. So wild. In our number 6 spot today, we have Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who, on April 30th, 2007, was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area, and on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know Los Angeles' history with things like that, that is not something to take lightly. Due to other crimes that Chester had committed where he was caught, he had to submit a DNA sample. This sample is what ended up leading authorities to solving these horrific crimes that he had committed. At the time, these cases were turning cold, but thankfully Chester being caught for other crimes is what allowed them to have a break in the case. In his original trial that led to conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following one in 2014, he also received an additional death sentence. In our number 5 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in other vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the locations of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He remains in prison and is currently 73 years old. In our number 4 spot today, we have the West Mesa Bone Collector. This is the name used to describe an unidentified serial killer who is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 11 different women whose remains were found buried in the desert of West Mesa in 2009. It is thought that this could be one person, or it could potentially be linked to some sort of a group. There have been tips throughout the years, and authorities have worked hard to try and get to the bottom of these crimes, but still, the killer remains at large. There have been a few different suspects throughout the years, but there hasn't been enough concrete evidence to charge anyone with the crimes yet. What's interesting about this case is that, although the remains were found in 2009, according to authorities, upon examining satellite images, it is believed that the last of the remains were placed there in 2005. In our number 3 spot today, we have Hebert Mullin. It is said that Hebert, before his crime spree, was quite bright and well liked. He was voted most likely to succeed in high school, but by his mid-30s his life had taken a dark turn, and he was now a serial killer who would go on to take the lives of at least 13 people. To be perfectly honest, Hebert definitely had some mental illness struggles that greatly contributed to the horrific crimes that he committed. That does not excuse what he has done, but it would be completely unfair not to mention that part of the story. Experts have explained that Hebert suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, and he believed that his crimes were preventing earthquakes in California. He only believed this sort of fantasy more after his arrest because, coincidentally, there were no earthquakes in California during his crime spree, but there was one shortly after his arrest. In 1973, he was sentenced to life in prison, and although he has been up for parole a number of times, he has been denied every time, with the next hearing taking place in 2025. In our number 2 spot today, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. This is one man who was exceptionally terrifying because of his actions, but he was also very smart, which adds an extra layer of terror to this one. Dahmer, who became known as the Milwaukee Monster, is one of the most prolific serial killers ever, and considering everyone we've talked about today, we know that's not an easy title to get. He became fixated with animals at a young age, and if you're interested in true crime and criminology, you know what happens next and how bad of a sign it is. Dahmer dropped out of business school due to alcohol abuse after just 3 months and enlisted in the US Army to train as a medical specialist, but that didn't last long as he was discharged after he attacked 2 fellow soldiers. After this, Dahmer fell hard into alcoholism, and this is when he went on his killing spree. Just to be clear, those 2 things are not related. I know you know that, but I don't want anyone to think otherwise. Between 1971 and 1999, Dahmer went on to take the lives of 17 people, and some of the things that came after included the permanent preservation of the body parts, typically all or part of the skeleton. So, yeah. Things were very dark. One of his victims was able to escape and booked it to the police, which is of course what led to Dahmer being caught for his atrocious crimes. When they got there, the chief medical examiner remarked that it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. In the end, Dahmer was tried and convicted and sentenced to 15 life imprisonments, and in February of 1992 he received an additional life sentence for a crime he hadn't yet been tried for that occurred in Ohio. In our number 1 spot today, we have Christopher Scarver. On June 1st, 1990, Christopher showed up at the Wisconsin Conservation Corps Training Program office, and there he demanded money from the man he found. When the man only gave him $15, Christopher went on to shoot him. Christopher then went and demanded money from another man and continued to shoot the man that he had already shot until this second man gave him more money. Christopher was caught and convicted for this atrocious crime, but his story does not end here. On November 28th, 1994, Christopher was assigned work detail with 2 other inmates. One was Jesse Anderson, who had taken the life of his own wife, and the other was none other than the man we just talked about, prolific serial killer and monster, Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, when the 3 were left alone, Christopher took a bar from a piece of equipment in the exercise room, and he used that to basically beat and then kill the other 2. Not gonna lie, there is no excuse and no reason for any of the crimes that these people committed, including these ones, but there is a very weird sort of poetic justice to that. Christopher was tried again for these 2 crimes and received 2 more life sentences.